Ladies and gentlemen, good morning from Helsinki. My name is Marco Valentini, and I'm here with my colleagues David Bell and Karel de Raad, representing the Evaluation Directorate at ECHA. Today, we are going to have a webinar on the information requirements under REACH. This is the first of two webinars on this topic, and it is part of the REACH 2013 campaign that ECHA organizes to support lead registrants which intend to register their substances by the 31st of May 2013 deadline. We obviously have no fire exits to point out today. There are, however, some housekeeping issues which I would like to address before we commence with the presentations, and these are in relation to the audio broadcast, the interaction during this event, and the questions and answer system. The audio is directly available through the Event Center tool, and it is activated as soon as you join the event. Also, you might have noticed that a control panel popped up automatically, and this will allow you to adjust the volume at your own preference. Therefore, make sure that the sounds are enabled on your computer, and either turn on your computer speakers or plug in a headset. During this event, you will not be able to verbally communicate with us. However, some degree of interaction is ensured through our questions and answers system. On the right side of your screen, you can find the Q&A panel, and once you expand the tab, you will find at the bottom of the panel a box where you can type in your questions, bearing in mind that you have a cap of 256 characters for each question. Once you have typed the question, please ensure that you select all panelists as a recipient from the drop-down list, and then click Send and await your answer. Your questions will be dealt with by the ECHA help desk and a pool of experts, which, depending on the difficulty of the question, may choose one of the following options. They will either provide a direct answer to your question, again using the Q&A panel. They will otherwise inform you that your question will be answered by a telephone session which will start after the webinar. Or finally, they could advise you to submit your question using the help desk contact form, which is available at the link here displayed. For the questions that are answered directly through the panel, the panelists will keep on answering after the presentations have ended for 1 hour. So if you have submitted a question but you didn't receive an answer before the end of the presentation, please do not log off just yet. For the questions answered by phone, the telephone session, as I said, will begin at the end of the webinar, and the panelists will propose some time slots during the webinar via the Q&A panel. For the questions that will be answered via the help desk form, once you have submitted your question, you will receive an acknowledgement of receipt, and your question and answer will be processed and sent back to you within 15 working days. Coming now to the program for today, we will shortly start with a presentation on the information requirements under REACH. We will then have a 15 minutes break, and upon return from the break, we will have a presentation on the evaluation and reporting of data, and in specific on the robust study summaries and study summaries. We will then go ahead with a presentation on the read across, grouping, and categories. And then, before saying goodbye, we will just highlight some of the key messages to take home from this webinar. I wish you, therefore, a fruitful webinar. We hope that you will find it interesting, and I will now hand over the floor to my colleague, David, for the first presentation. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you very much, Marco. Welcome to the webinar from Helsinki. I'm going to talk about information requirements under REACH. This is the structure of the presentation. we're going to talk about identifying the information requirements, how you meet the information requirements, the important issue of testing proposals, how you propose new tests to get information, and adaptations for the information requirement. And at the end of the session, I've also got a list of some useful information, some useful references, which can provide you with some further information to help you in your queries. So let's start off by talking about identifying the information requirements that you're going to have to comply with. There are several places that you have to look within REACH to find out what you're dealing with. First of all, I bring your attention to Annex VI. Annex VI is very important. It contains numerous bits of information you will want to be aware of. Among these, it contains a guide for how to go through this process, which effectively I will recapitulate today. Secondly, it gives an indication of some of the fundamentals, some of the basic information that is required for your substance. And finally, it also deals with the issue of substance identity. I will re-emphasize substance identity in this information requirement because the identity of your substance is a fundamental issue. And if the identity is misspecified, if you identify your chemical in a wrong manner, or if you aren't able to tell what your chemical is, everything subsequent to that will be in difficulty. So if you identify a wrong chemical or test a wrong chemical, you could have the possibility that you might have to do all your tests again. So substance identity is an issue that I bring to your attention as a very important one that must be addressed. Moving on from that, you then have the information requirements of Annexes 7 to 10. And this is a tonnage-based scheme where as the tonnage increments per year, as the amount of tons of chemical per year goes up, so you have to fill in more of the Annexes 7 to 10. Be aware that there are exceptions to this scheme. So for example, on-site isolated intermediates have Articles 17 and 49, and so they have a different scheme. Transported isolated intermediates also have a different article, Article 18, which covers the requirements which apply to them. And there's also a different arrangement for chemicals that had prior registration under a previous regulation, NONS, and that's covered by Article 24. So just be aware that there are different conditions that apply under different circumstances, and you should be aware of those. Having said that, you've still got to identify the information requirements that apply in your case. When you're looking at Annexes 7 to 10, it's very important that you consider not only the column 1 requirements, which are the headers that tell you what you've got to do, but you've also got to consider carefully both column 1 and column 2 requirements. And just for example, we give the example of Annex 9, 9.2.1, which is biotic degradation. Here, the column 1 requirement depends upon whether the substance is readily biodegradable. If the substance is readily biodegradable, there is no column 1 requirement. So this gives you an indication where it's not just the column 1 requirement, but you've got to carefully read the column 2 text to see if there is an information that you have to provide. This is a fairly simple example, but there are actually cases where more complex judgments are required. So it is an important issue that you work out whether you do have an information need, and what's more important, you should carefully document your rationale. So for example, if you think that your substance is readily biodegradable, you should say so, and you should give the reason why you think it's readily biodegradable. You should also note that there are interactions between the annexes. So adaptations can become available depending on the results from other studies. And just as an example of this, we have the idea of repeat dose toxicity. Now, at Annex VIII, there's a requirement for a 28-day study. However, if you have already performed a study at Annex 9 or 10 for a subchronic study or a chronic study, these would be a waiver for having to perform the 28-day test. So it's very important you consider whether or not there is an information requirement to be met, and what those requirements are for your particular circumstances. The next step is deciding how to meet the information requirements that you've already established. And there's a whole series of processes which you should go through to do this properly. First of all, you should gather existing information. And this should include all the relevant and available information on the substance. You should be looking at physical chemical properties, environmental toxicity and fate, mammalian toxicity, and you can also consider alternative information sources, for example, from QSARs or for in vitro methods, amongst others. You will need to get information on the manufacture and use of the substance, the risk management measures that are in place for the substance, what the exposure is to the substance under certain circumstances, and the classification and labeling, particularly if the substances has a harmonized classification and labeling. You should also bring in to consideration available information from assessments carried out under other international and national programs. So the whole of this information package can be important in determining how you proceed and how you move forward. Once you have that information, it's important that you evaluate the quality of that information. So there are a number of things that come up here. One is the question, is the data adequate for the purpose of classification and labeling? And it obviously has to meet that standard. Is it appropriate for the assessment of the persistent bioaccumulative and toxic properties of the substance? Is it appropriate for the assessment of very persistent and very bioaccumulative properties? And is it appropriate for risk assessment? So these are important issues, but you've also got to look at the issue of whether the data is reliable and is it relevant for your particular endpoint. So these are important things that you've got to look at and consider with your information. The next step is to take the information that you have and mesh that up with the information requirements that you've already identified. And here the question is, does the information that I have comply with the requirements that I have to meet? So for example, do I have all the information that's needed for Annex VI? And again, a particular issue here is the issue of substance identity. It's really important that you're able to provide good information about the substance identity so we can be clear that it is a substance, that it isn't misspecified, and that you have appropriate analytical information so that we know that it's a sensible substance to work with. And as I said previously, if you get the substance identity wrong, everything that follows thereafter is jeopardized. So it's very important that you cover that correctly. Does the information that you've got comply with the tonnage ban requirements? And again, you've got to look at the appropriate annex, Annex 7, 8, 9, or 10, to see if you've got information that meshes with the appropriate tonnage bands and the requirements in each of those tonnage bands. And then there's a separate issue, which is that you have an obligation to provide all available and relevant data irrespective of tonnage. And again here, just as an example, it may be that a carcinogenicity study has been done on your substance, but your substance is only at Annex 9. If you're aware of that data and the data is available to you and it's relevant for your substance, you should include it in the dossier, even though it's not a requirement at Annex 9. Finally, you should consider the potential options for adaptation found in column 2 of Annexes 7 to 10, and also the options for adaptation that are found in Annex 11. So here we're meshing, we're seeing if the information that you already have meets the information requirements that you've identified. And the next formal step in this process is to check, to find out if you have information gaps. If there's an information that you have to provide and you don't already have information that meets that. If you have a potential gap, it's worthwhile checking if other data holders within a SIEF, a Substance Information Exchange Forum, have the relevant data. They may have that data and it may be able to become available. There's an optional proposition that you may be able to check if data holders in other SIEFs have data that is relevant. For example, you may be able to find data for a substance that might be useful for read-across purposes. If you do have an information gap, then you should apply risk management measures to take care of the fact that you don't know about the information gap. Finally, if you've still got outstanding information gap, then you need to address those and move on to the next step. The next step, of course, is generating new information so that you have compliance with all the requirements of the appropriate annexes. New data can be generated by alternative methodologies. There's a variety of approaches available, from QSARs, in vitro tests, weight of evidence, and grouping approaches. And these can all be tried if it's appropriate and relevant for your substance and your endpoint. There is an overarching concern that animal tests should be only performed as a last resort if there is no other means of satisfying the information requirement. However, if you're not able to satisfy the information requirement, then the test has to be performed. And there's an important distinction here. If the information is a requirement from Annexes 7 or 8, then you simply perform the test straight away. You're simply able to proceed. However, if the test is a test listed in Annexes 9 or 10, then you must submit a testing proposal before doing the test. So that's an important distinction. If it's an information requirement at 7 or 8, you don't provide a testing proposal. If it's at 9 or 10, you do. We're going to cover testing proposals just briefly because they're an important element of meeting the information requirements. These are required for tests at Annex 9 and at Annex 10. When you submit a testing proposal, you do so in your Euclid dossier. You submit a registration dossier in Euclid. It's very important that you flag in Euclid that you have a testing proposal. It's very important that the testing proposal does not just go into the chemical safety report, but it must be in the Euclid file. This can be done quite simply. Within Euclid, for the relevant endpoint, there is a field which is called the study result type. That has a menu in it, and one of the options on that menu is experimental study planned. If you tick that option, that flags it as a testing proposal within Euclid. So it's very easy to do from an IT perspective. But it's very important that that gets done in the Euclid file. A final point to make on testing proposals is that it's important that you don't undertake testing while the testing proposal is being evaluated. That wouldn't be a valid testing proposal. So again, just reiterating it, these are for Annex 9 and for Annex 10 tests only, not for 7 and 8, and that you mustn't undertake testing while the testing proposal is being evaluated. ECHA then evaluates the testing proposal. And there are a number of things that have come up that are very important for that process of addressing the testing proposal. First of all, substance identity must be clearly and correctly addressed. It's an absolute prerequisite for us. If we have sufficient concerns about the identity of the substance, it can mean that we don't even know what you're testing on, or that we think that maybe it isn't a substance or is two substances. So it's very important that you identify the substance clearly and correctly at this stage. Otherwise, the consequence could be that you have to redo the test at a later stage because the information substance identity is not good enough. So it's very important that you address substance identity. It's important when you're putting in a testing proposal that you clearly identify the test that you're proposing to do and to provide all the necessary information. So for example, here we have an example that you might say we want to do a prenatal developmental toxicity test, and you give the particular test that you want to do according to the OECD test guideline 414, and that you say it's in the rat, and you say that it's by the oral route. So that's an example of specifying clearly some of the parameters. It's very helpful, it's very important, if you explain and justify a number of issues as well. It's important that you explain why the test is necessary. Sometimes this can be very, very simple. For example, for a prenatal developmental toxicity test, it may be the case that this is an Annex 9 requirement for your substance that has to be fulfilled. And this is straightforward information requirement. And so it's very easy to write that very clear why you're doing it. However, as I've indicated previously, some of the information requirements are more complex. And it's very useful that you actually set out your reasoning why you think there is an information requirement that must be met. It may be that you have other concerns which aren't simply to do with the REACH information requirements. For example, you may have a concern for inhalation exposure in workers, and you're worried there might be a health concern there. If that's the case, it's not a problem. It's important that you document why you think you've got a concern and what the need is, for example, doing an inhalation study so that you can address a worker need would be an example. But it's very important that you set out why you think you have a need to do the test, and so that we can look at that and understand why you're doing it. It's also important that you specify the key test parameters. So for example, the choice of the test that you're using, the choice of route of exposure, the choice of the substance that you're testing. And the reason that I'm emphasizing this is because ECA has a duty to evaluate testing proposals. And if we don't have this information, it's very difficult for us to evaluate them. And this makes it very difficult both for you, because we're evaluating based sometimes on an inadequate database, and for us. And we want to get a good result out of this. So if you're clear about what you're doing, that gives us a much better basis for proceeding and being able to offer you helpful advice. So here again, an issue that's very important is explaining and justifying what you're doing. And that's a recurring theme, I think, in our presentations. I've just covered testing proposals, and they're an important element. But I now move on to adaptations, in that there are several potential options in REACH for adapting the information requirements of Annexes 7 to 10. There are several ways of doing this, and the legal ways that are specified in REACH are here. You have specific criteria which are given in column 2 of Annexes 7 to 10. You have general criteria which are available for adaptation, and these are listed in Annex 11. And these come under 3 headings: where testing isn't scientifically necessary, where testing isn't technically possible, or for substance-tailored exposure-driven testing. A key point is this: if you adapt an information requirement, if you say, I am not providing this data, then you have to provide a reason. And it must be one of these reasons that we're giving here. One of the specific criteria in column 2, or a general criteria in Annex 11. So you must directly address the legal requirement and explain and justify why you are allowed to use that adaptation. If you use a very general statement, for example, I am not doing this because I think I don't have to, then it's not one of the specific criteria that are allowed in the REACH requirement. So it's not something we can take on board. You must conform to what the REACH adaptations are that are available to you. I cover a little bit about Annex 11, Part 1. There are a variety of options that are available to you, and these include the use of existing data. You may have existing data which is historically available, which isn't performed to good laboratory practice standards, historical human data. These are possible if it meets the tests of Annex 11 1.1. You can use a weighted evidence approach. You can use QSARs. You can use in vitro methods, and you can use grouping and read across. The key issue is these are all possible, but you have to meet the specific tests that are in each of these sections of Annex 11. You have to provide adequate and reliable documentation that justifies your use of the adaptation. And that's an important part. If you do not provide adequate and reliable documentation, we can't assess if you have if the adaptation is good. So it's very important that you provide documentation. To help you, there are a number of guidance documents and practical guides which you can use to try and make sure that your adaptations are as well designed as possible. And there's also a guide on avoiding unnecessary animal testing. Let me just give you an example here, which is Annex 11 1.5, grouping and read across. This is an adaptation which is used very frequently. I want to deal with this at a high level because it will be dealt with subsequently by my colleague Carol Derat. But it's very important that you're aware of what it says in the legal text. And specifically, the important issue, or one important issue that I bring to your mind, is the bit about adequate and reliable documentation of why you think you can adapt using this method. There is a specific guidance, and it sets out the standard which you need to meet to get adequate documentation. And part of that is to provide a hypothesis why you think the read-across approach works. So again, there's a practical guide in that, but the key issue again here is this issue of adequate and reliable documentation. That has to be provided in order for us to be able to assess whether or not your adaptation meets the standards of the legal text. Annex 11, Section 3, also allows for exposure-based adaptation. It's restricted in its coverage, so it's for endpoints in Annexes 9 to 10, and Section 8.6 and 8.7 of Annex 8. But here, you're looking at whether there's potentially low exposure, and that justifies avoiding filling in certain information endpoints. So in order to be able to use this approach, you actually need to have information on the exposure scenarios. So specifically here, you've got to have exposure scenarios developed in the chemical safety report. And if you don't have those, then you can't meet the standard for an adaptation under Annex 11, Section 3. So you need to have an exposure scenario developed for this option. It's also important that you are able to document that the specific criteria that are listed in Annex 11, Section 3 and that are relevant to your case can be met, and that they are met in your particular circumstances. So this option is available, but you've got to meet the specific requirements of the legal text. So that summarizes some of the adaptations that are available to you. With that, I bring you to some links. These cover some relevant material which will help you find out some of the guidance that I've been talking about. The evaluation progress report listed at the bottom gives an annual update on what we are finding in evaluation dossiers and gives you our latest tips on how to improve your dossier to get good compliance. And we've got a variety of guidance and practical guides that are available on the ECHA website. With that, I thank you very much for your attention. My name is David Bell. You can contact ECHA through the website and ask further questions there at subsequent parts after this webinar has finished. After this presentation, we will have a 15-minute break, and the next speaker will be Marco Valentini, who's talking about evaluation and reporting of data. Thanks very much for your attention.
Good morning, everyone, again, and welcome back to our webinar event. We will now move on to the second presentation for today, with which I intend to cover the topic about evaluation and reporting of data, and more specifically, robust study summaries and study summaries. The aims for this presentation are pretty straightforward. We would like to address what robust study summaries and study summaries are, and then when and how you should use them. First of all, by comparing robust study summaries and study summaries, we can identify a few similarities and differences. In fact, both types of summaries are similar as they represent a fundamental obligation for registrants to report the available data and they are an essential tool for ECHA to carry out its tasks under evaluation. On the other hand, we can certainly identify a difference in the conditions when they are required, in the level of detail that they need to cover, but also in their overall purpose. In terms of reporting, then, they differ in the type of Euclid fields that need to be filled in. But before you actually get to draft a robust study summary or a study summary, there are two main other steps you need to complete. The first one is the evaluation of the quality of the data that you have available, which means an assessment of the relevance, the adequacy, and the reliability of your data. The second step is the selection of one or more case studies for each endpoint, which will form the basis for your assessment of that endpoint. Finally, those studies will be reported to ECHA for an evaluation of your assessment, either as a robust study summary or as a study summary. Let's now look in more detail to each of the aforementioned three steps. As said, the first one is the evaluation of the available data, which consists of three major aspects: relevance, adequacy, and reliability. The evaluation of the relevance aims at determining the appropriateness of the data and the tests for particular hazard identification or risk characterization. In order to help you with this evaluation, we have provided you here below with a series of questions for your consideration. But please bear in mind that the list is not non-exhaustive. However, just to mention a couple of them, a crucial consideration is if the tested substance is the same as the registered substance, a concept which has been highlighted and stressed particularly in the previous presentation. Another example is whether the route of the exposure tested is relevant when compared to the exposures associated with the use of the substance in workplaces. The second aspect of your evaluation will be the adequacy of your data. In other words, you need to determine whether the information you have is sufficient for the purpose of classification and labeling and or risk assessment. Therefore, your data will be logically adequate, for example, if the substance meets the criteria for classification and labeling, but also if your substance is a potential PBT or VPVB substance, or if the data allows an appropriate DNL or PNEC derivation for risk assessment purposes. The third aspect of the evaluation regards the reliability of the available data. With this term, we refer to the quality of the study, the test methods, and how the results and the conclusions are reported. In order to assess the reliability, you can refer to the CLIMISH scoring system, which is also the system that is embedded in a Euclid for the reporting of study records. With this system, you can assign a score from 1 to 4 to your study, depending on the quality. The highest reliability is associated with a score of 1, that is, a reliability without restrictions. These, in general, will be studies conducted according to valid and internationally accepted test guidelines, or closely related or comparable methods. The lowest reliability score, on the contrary, is number 4, which is not assignable. This refers to data or studies listed in short abstracts or secondary literature. The second step prior to the drafting of the summaries is that of the selection of your key study, and the graphic in this slide is a good start to do so. Therefore, you need to ask yourself whether there are adequate studies available or not. Please bear in mind that the term study includes also information that is generated by alternative testing methods, for example, by accusers or in vitro studies. So, if the answer to the question is no, then you can use these less reliable studies in a weight of evidence approach, if that is possible. If this is not possible, then you need to generate new information, as it was clearly outlined in the previous presentation. However, hopefully you can answer yes to the question because you hold adequate studies. In this case, there are two possible scenarios. The first one is that you have only one adequate study, and the easy consequence of this is that it will also represent your key study. The second option is that you have more than one adequate study, and again you will have two possibilities. The first one is that within the group of adequate studies, there is one study which clearly represents your key study, whereas all the others will represent the supporting studies to the key study itself. The second option is that, on the contrary, the conclusions of the various studies are different or conflicting with each other. The key study needs to appropriately describe a specific endpoint and will form the basis for the risk assessment. Therefore, you can clearly imagine that this step is crucial for the following parts of your reporting. More specifically, and as previously mentioned, your decision will be based upon the relevance, adequacy, and reliability of the study. Usually, the key study is actually a study which gives rise to the highest concern, and the reliability score is either 1 or 2, but not less. We now reached our final step, which is the drafting of the summaries. The graphic in this slide gives you already an idea of what type of study is needed depending on the scenario which is applicable to your situation. But let's now look in more detail at the features of these two types of summaries. Let's remember again quickly that by comparing the robust study summaries and the study summaries, we identify two major similarities that they both are fundamental obligations for the registrants to report the available data, and they are essential for our evaluation tasks at ECHA. They also differ in when they are required, in their level of details, in their overall purpose, and in the IUCLID fields that need to be filled in when reporting. Let's then start with the first one and ask ourselves, what is a robust study summary? The definition is in Article 328 of REACH, and it refers to a detailed summary which the registrant needs to provide in order to allow scientists at ECHA, but also other scientists, making an independent assessment of the study, thus minimizing the need to consult the full study report, which obviously would be very time-consuming. The question is, therefore, what is the level of detail that is needed for a robust study summary? Generally speaking, the robust study summary should contain as many details as necessary. The bottom line is that scientists at ECHA should be able to assess the reliability and the completeness of the study by the text of the robust study summary, which therefore needs to describe the test protocol and justify the validity of the results, but also needs to demonstrate that the correct case study or key studies have been chosen for a specific endpoint. In terms of reporting the robust study summary, this means the completion of detail level 2 in a Euclid. That is the completion of the basic fields plus the additional information fields. And now let's look at when a robust study summary is required, or in other words, when it is mandatory. Article 10A(7) states that a robust study summary is required if it is required under Annex I in the technical dossier. In practice, this means that a robust study summary is required anytime a CSR is required, meaning for substances at or above 10 tons per annum, and for the key studies. An important consideration needs to be made if you have known standard studies. In other words, studies that do not follow standard guidelines or, for example, are not performed according to GLP laboratory practices. If you find yourself in this situation, then please note that you still have to provide a robust study summary anytime you use such studies as key studies. Thus, a justification will be always needed. However, if you use such non-standard studies as supportive studies, then the justification is not needed. This is a fundamental difference which I would like to stress. The underlying principle, which I hope is clear, is that the more the study deviates from a standard testing guideline, and the more information is needed to enable a good evaluation. Now, the aforementioned were the cases when a robust study summary is mandatory. In addition, we also have some cases in which the robust study summaries are anyway recommended. These are for all the key studies, also for substances at less than 10 tons per annum, and for physicochemical endpoints, but also for all the studies that are used as a part of a weight of evidence, and for known key studies demonstrating a higher concern than a key study. Furthermore, a robust study summary is recommended when the study gives ambiguous results, and, as mentioned in the previous slide, when the study is performed according to known standard protocols. So please bear in mind there are requirements for robust study summaries, and there are such cases, as outlined in this slide, when they are still recommended. The other type of possible summary is the study summary, which Article 329 of REACH defines as a summary that needs to allow scientists at ECHA making an assessment, just like for the robust study summary, but in this case, the assessment is about the relevance of the study. And again, let's ask ourselves, what is the level of details that is needed for this type of summary? Well, generally speaking, the study summaries are less detailed than their other family member, but as we just mentioned, the relevance of the study should be addressed in sufficient details to perform a proper evaluation of these aspects. In terms of reporting via a Euclid, instead, a detail level 1 is sufficient, which means the completion of the basic fields only. So the level of detail for these summaries is less than for the robust study summaries, but please do not think that this means that they should be not detailed enough to address the relevance of the study in question. When do you need to prepare a study summary then? Well, the first instance is for the key studies submitted for registration of substances manufactured or imported at 1 to 10 tons per annum. Though it is important to highlight that even though it is not a legal requirement, ECHA still recommends to provide a robust study summary also for this type of key studies. The second instance when you need to draft the study summary is for the supportive studies. But please bear in mind that there is an exception. This is that when the supportive study indicates a higher concern than the selected key study, then you will still need to provide a robust study summary for these supportive studies. Let's now try to recap the information that we have provided in this presentation. You will start by asking yourself whether you have adequate studies available. If the answer is yes, you may have the option that only one adequate study is identified or is available, and this will naturally represent and be selected as your key study and will be reported to ECHA by means of a robust study summary. In the instance in which you will have more than one adequate key study, we have again two possible options. The first one is that from the pool of your studies, you can identify one clear key study, and the rest of your studies represent a supportive study to the key study. In this instance, the robust study summary is needed for the key study, and the study summary is needed for the supporting studies, except for those situations which we have noticed, we have explained previously. If you have more than one key study where the information is either different or conflicting, or if you have less reliable studies, then robust study summaries will be required for all the studies which are used as a part of a weight of evidence. So, having addressed the necessary steps you need to follow for a correct evaluation and the reporting of your data, let's now briefly look at what is the experience that we gained so far at ECHA regarding this family of summaries. Well, the robust study summaries which have been evaluated so far clearly show some important differences in quality. And these findings have been already addressed under dossier evaluation, consequently leading to a series of requests for more detailed summaries to be provided. We would like to stress again that these summaries are essential to allow ECHA carrying out its assessment tasks. So in what regard are the summaries of poor quality? Well, from our experience so far, some frequent errors have been identified, and we would like to highlight them here. First of all, the validity, the reliability, and the repeatability criteria are sometimes missing. Therefore, no independent evaluation is actually possible. Another aspect is that the reporting of the test results is generally poor. And in this regard, ECHA would encourage the registrants to make use of tabular or graphical forms for this purpose. Last but not least, we have noticed that there is an unclear or insufficient level of detail on the test material, the methods, and the results justifications for the key study selection, but also that the final conclusions at the end of the endpoint study record are sometimes missing. We hope that the key messages to take home from these presentations are quite clear. Firstly, make sure to provide us with good documentation, as this is essential for a reliable evaluation. Secondly, that a robust study summary is necessary for each key study. With that said, we came to the end of this presentation, and with this slide we provide you with some useful links where you can find further information on this topic. I would like to thank you very much for your attention, and I will now hand over the floor to my colleague Karel for the next presentation.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Karel de Raad. I'm a toxicologist working at ECHA, and I will concentrate this morning on one way to, let's say, to provide alternatives to the normal standard data requirement, a way of providing these alternatives, which is addressed in Annex 11 1.5, and that's about read across, grouping, and categories. And I want to address the possibilities and the limitation of this alternative. First, something about read across in the context of reads. An information requirements of reads for a certain substance is not met by means of a standard study with a registered substance. That's the situation where you're in. However, you have data available as a registrant for one or more other substances that are similar in some aspects to the substance for which a registration dossier is prepared by you. And you claim as a registrant that the data obtained with the other substance for which you have data available can be used to meet the information requirement for the registered substances. This is, in short, read across. They are doing read across from the other substances to the registered substance. So you predict the property for the registered substance on the basis of data you have available, you have obtained with other substances. This is a facility which is offered by REACH, and REACH is in that respect special, because most other regulations or legal frameworks are dealing with the registration or whatever the authorization of chemical substances do not have the facility of read across. It's covered by Annex 11 of the REACH regulation, and the title of this annex is General Rules for Adaptation of the Standard Testing Regimen set out in Annexes 7 to 10. You already heard a lot about that this morning. Section 1.5 is titled Grouping of Substances and Read Across Approach. And then it reads there, substances with physicochemical, toxicological, and ecotoxicological properties that are likely to be similar or follow a regular pattern as a result of structural similarity may be considered as a group or category of substances. Please note that it does not mean that the group and category are necessarily the same thing. It further reads there that application of the group concept requires that physicochemical properties, human health effects, and environmental effects, or environmental fate, may be predicted from data for reference substances within the group by interpolation to other substances in the group. And then it's between brackets, it reads, this is called the read across approach. It's also stipulated in Annex 11 1.5 that the similarities between these chemicals, so between the chemicals you want to read across, among the chemicals you want to read across, is that they have a common, that it can have, the similarities may be based on they having a common functional group, or that they have common precursors and or the likelihood of common breakdown products via physical or biological processes which result in structurally similar chemicals, or a constant pattern in the changing of the potency of the properties across the category. This is not an exhaustive list. These are just a number of examples of possibilities. If the group concept is applied, substances shall be classified and labeled on this basis. And this is very important. In all cases, the results you obtain by applying a group concept, so by applying read-across, should be adequate for the purpose of classification and labeling and or risk assessment. So they should be so good, so reliable that you can do classification and labeling and you can perform a decent risk assessment on the basis of the outcome of the read-across. They should have an adequate and reliable coverage of the key parameters addressed in the corresponding test methods referred to in Article 13.3. And they should also cover the duration of the test methods. So what this says is that what you obtain by read-across should address the parameters that are addressed in the study which you want to replace and should, let's say, be compatible with that study if you're talking about the duration and frequency of exposure, etc. The most important, I think, well, they are of course all four important, but a very important one is that adequate and reliable documentation of the applied method shall be provided. And this is often in case a reason, I anticipate now, on the evaluation of read-across cases by ECHA, this is one of the most important reasons why read-across cases cannot be accepted, fail. If you're doing read-across, we're talking normally about source and target substances. The other substances are called source substances. They are the source of the data that is used to fill the data gap. The substance for which the REACH registration dossier is prepared is called the target substance. The read-across is targeted at this substance. This means that its REACH requirement is met by means of data obtained with the source substances. So a very simple figure, the bottom of this slide, is that we have sources. We can have more than one sources, and then we apply, let's say, we claim that the data obtained with these sources tell us something about, or can be used for, the target. And this process is called read-across. If we're talking about read-across, then we're also automatically talking about groups and categories. A group is a number of chemicals that, due to their similarity, are expected to have similar REACH-relevant properties. So they are similar in chemical structure or whatever chemical descriptor, and so we expect them to have a similar REACH-relevant property, let's say dermal irritation or fish toxicity. This does not mean that this similarity is connected to all REACH-relevant properties. So a group of a number of chemicals need not to have similar, the same REACH-relevant properties for all properties that play a role under REACH. Category is a special sort of group. In a category, you see a certain trend. A trend when a chemical descriptor or physical chemical property are plotted against a REACH-relevant property. For instance, oral repeated dose toxicity in rats is a REACH-relevant property, and the chemical descriptor can then, for instance, be the chain length in the case of alkanes, for instance, the number of C atoms. And if you plot that, then maybe we see some sort of trend, and we have this trend, and in this respect, this group is category. The trends we are seeing can be increasing, can be constant, can be decreasing, it can be linear or non-linear. Read-across can be done to fill data gaps for chemicals belonging to a group, but not for chemicals belonging to a category. So a group of a number of chemicals need not to have similar REACH-relevant properties. So a group of a number of chemicals need not to have similar REACH-relevant properties for all properties that play a role under REACH. Category is a special sort of group. In a category, you see a certain trend. A trend when a chemical descriptor or physical chemical property are plotted against a REACH-relevant property. For instance, oral repeated dose toxicity in rats is a REACH-relevant property, and the chemical descriptor can then, for instance, be the chain length in the case of alkanes, for instance, the number of C atoms. And if you plot that, then maybe we see some sort of trend, and in this respect, this group is category. The trends we are seeing can be increasing, can be constant, can be decreasing, it can be linear or non-linear. these are then just analogues, chemicals belonging to a group, or chemicals belonging to a category. In the case of the category, the trend we see provides extra predictive power. So read across for the endpoint is stronger in most cases if it's supported by a trend. So if it's done in a category. If we only have a group, then we call that under reach an analog approach read across. If the group is category, so that we have it's supported by trend, then we call that category approach read across. It's important to realize that trends can be established for some endpoints in the group and not for others. It is a resistant responsibility to analyze the endpoints for which the category holds. And assuming the same trend for all endpoints and all substances in a category is often not credible. A group can be very small. The smallest group consists of two substances. Well, if you want to see a trend in a group, so if you are dealing with categories, then you may need many more substances. Anyhow, the message I want to convey is that if you do not have trends, then we do not have a category. Read across is strengthened when the responses of source chemicals in a group point in the same direction, while it's obviously weakened if the source chemicals point to different directions. We can distinguish many to one read across, so that we have many sources and one target. Or in some cases we have only one source and we have many targets. Obviously, the first possibility is better practice and gives more reliability and predictive power than the second. The number of targets that can be covered by one source, so let's say the least favorable option under the second bullet point, depends on the strength of the read across. Read across can be very obvious and very strong, and in that case you may have, it may be justified to use one source to predict the properties of many targets. Read across from one source to many targets has an additional undesirable effect that it multiplies uncertainty over many hazard assessments. Read across goes with an extra uncertainty, and this uncertainty then is divided over all the targeted substances. It is better if the uncertainty then increases too much to test a number of additional sources so as to come to a better prediction of the hazards you can expect for the target substances, the substances which you want to compile registration dossiers for. It should be realized that read across introduces extra uncertainty. The data requirement is normally met by means, a data requirement by means of an experimental study, for instance, an oral 90-day study with rats. Extra uncertainty is introduced by read across because we have to translate from an experimental study with a similar substance to an experimental study with the registered substance. We have to do a prediction. According to the REACH guidance, this uncertainty is to be addressed by means of an extra uncertainty factor, always, and the lowest uncertainty factor, assessment factor, applied during denial derivation, if this denial derivation is based on read across, is 2. But if the read across is, let's say, goes with a lot of uncertainty, then this factor can be higher, up to 10. Read across means that the properties are predicted and not directly measured. And now I come to the core, I think, of the presentation of read across cases in REACH registration dossiers, is that the registrant has to explain why this is possible. And this is not the task of ECHA. So the core of every read across proposal, whether based on groups or on categories, should be such an explanation. We often call it also the read-across hypothesis, or it can be called just read-across justification. Often this explanation needs to be supported with experimental data. If there is no sufficient explanation as to why it's possible to read across, then the read across cannot be accepted during the evaluation. There are several types of supporting data that can be used to underpin read across. It depends obviously from the explanation, the type of explanation. Often it's very important, very supporting, if you have data on the absorption, distribution, metabolism, the excretion, the elimination of source and or target. So on the toxicokinetics, or it's also used the acronym ATME. In vitro data are related to the effect, can also help you for which a read across is proposed. The in vitro data are often more easily to obtain, less costly, and they can give you a lot of extra supporting information. Then in silico investigation, that means that you, with a sort of computerized expert system or another compute tool, you are basically mining all knowledge that there is about the toxicity of chemical compounds. Well, this mine of data can really help you to support your read-across case. And they, of course, also data for other reach-relevant properties which may, to a certain extent, be related to the property you are interested in. Anyhow, this supporting data can be any scientific data that really enhances the credibility of the read-across explanation. You are free to choose whatever you want, as long as it's credible in a scientific way and it supports your read-across explanation. Scientific credibility of the explanation is really crucial. And I add to that the registrants should always make their case, not error. I draw your attention again for the second time to an important part of the legal text. That's adequate and reliable documentation of the applied method shall be provided. And this adequate and reliable documentation does not only cover the test methods or the identity of the source substance or the species that you used in the test, but it also covers the whole read-across explanation. So if you have a beautiful Clemish 1 test with source substance and you do not explain why the result of this test can be used for the target, then the read-across explanation is missing, and there is the read-across cannot be accepted based on the fact that no adequate and reliable documentation is provided. There's something about structural similarity, which is of course the basis of read-across. The identity of a substance is defined by structures, composition, and so-called chemical descriptors. It's very important to realize that the statement, these chemicals are similar as such, and these words as such are very important here, has no meaning in the context of REACH. Chemical similarity should always be brought in relation to some sort of identifier of the substance, of the structure, the composition of a chemical descriptor. The core of every read-across explanation, what makes the source and the target structurally similar, that's the core, and how that is related to the endpoint for which a data gap has to be filled by means of read-across. Actually, it should always also be addressed what makes the source and the target structurally dissimilar, and how does that affect the possibilities to read across. Well, there are several scenarios, several possibilities to read across. There are several explanations of hypotheses possible. I will not go in detail, but you can think of trend analysis in a category combined with a mechanistic explanation. Another possibility, in some cases, well, it hardly ever occurs, but in some cases the trend is so clear that it's self-evident that you can do read across. There can be trends in other endpoints than the endpoint for which the data gap has to be filled. For instance, when many other toxicological parameters show a clear common trend, it may be reasoned that the read across endpoint will follow the same trend. This explanation often has to be combined with other explanations, for instance, explanations based on mechanistic considerations. A quite frequently used explanation for read across is that in the end, identical metabolites or chemical transformation products are formed, and that we are actually dealing with equal exposure, equal in the sense also of two equal substances of the sensitive organs and tissues. Well, the most difficult form of explanation is when you claim that you have source and a target which remain different, also after metabolization, after the toxicokinetics, but are still similar enough to have similar effects in kinetics. So then you actually claim that two different compounds have the same effect, which is of course always very difficult to prove. Often a worst case approach is followed in read across. Depending on the role of the outcome of read across in hazard assessment, this approach can be followed. In some cases, it's possible to argue that source will anyhow be more toxic than a target. And then an underestimation of a hazard is then prevented. Well, that's in a sense, in many cases, a very attractive approach. But one should always ask oneself whether the overestimation is acceptable, whether it's still meaningful. For instance, you could use a very toxic read across from a very, very toxic chemical to fill in every data point. Well, everyone knows that would be an absurd approach. But we should always be very aware that read across can also be not conservative enough, and that there can be an underestimation of hazard. If that's the case, if there is any indication that you underestimate hazard, then read across will not be accepted for that reason. The identity of the substance is, of course, very important. Validity of read across may be affected by the composition of and the impurities in the source and or the target. In particular, if the impurities in the target contribute to the toxicity while they are not present in the source. So you might want to test a very pure, 100% pure source and try to predict to a very similar target substance which has 10% of impurity. Well, we are never sure to what extent toxicity is caused by these 10%, or to what extent the 10% of impurity influences toxicity of the target substance. ECHA has to evaluate read across proposals, and this evaluation depends on the role of read across in the REACH registration dossier. In the standard case, the role is to meet an entire information requirement, and then we have to be strict. It can also be part of a weight of evidence analysis, and then of course depends very much of the importance, the role it plays in this weight of evidence analysis. It can be qualitative, for instance, if you want to predict an OAL, the starting point for dinyl derivation, but it can also be qualitative. That's, for instance, when we're dealing with irritation, of sensitization, of mutagenicity. It can also be part of an integrated testing strategy, just to support making choices, what to test and how to test in the next step. This all determines the evaluation, influences, I should say, the evaluation. The evaluation often goes wrong because the case has to be rejected because essential information is lacking. Quality of the explanation, as I've said before, and the supporting data play a crucial role in ECHA's evaluation. And because read across is a prediction, it's ultimately based, the evaluation has ultimately be based on expert judgment. Uncertainty or lack of quality of read-across case may be compensated for by extra uncertainty assessment factor and thus lower DNLs. Supporting data needs to be present in a dossier and not just referred to. You should, in many cases, you need to provide study summaries or even robust study summaries for the supporting data when they are really crucial in let's say, the defense, making your point in the case of read-across. This also holds for literature data. Literature data can play an important role in underpinning read-across. And if they do, you should summarize, you should address them properly. There is guidance produced by ECHA on read-across. Here you find a link to this guidance. There's also a practical guide how to report read-across in categories. There's a lot of literature about read-across and categories. For categories, you can have a look at the OECD website. If you follow ECHA's guidance, that ensures that your read-across proposal receives all the attention it deserves. Here I reach the end of my presentation, and I hand over the floor back to Marco for the summary of this event. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Karel, and hello everyone again. So before saying goodbye, I would like to go through some of the key messages to take home from today's webinar. And these are that regarding the first presentation, which was on the information requirements under REACH, remember that any adaptations to the standard testing regime, meaning the column 1 of annexes 7 to 10 of the REACH regulation, must meet the conditions set out in Annex 11 or in column 2 of the annexes 7 to 10. And most importantly is that a clear justification for any adaptation must be provided. In relation to the testing proposals, remember that for tests under Annex 9 and 10, you need to submit a proposal to do the testing prior to conducting the tests. This is really important and crucial because doing a test before getting ECHA's decision may lead to legal action. Remember also that registrants have an obligation to share data resulting from animal tests and to share the costs before submitting the dossier for registration. Regarding the second presentation on the evaluation and the reporting of the data, please bear in mind that robust study summaries should contain enough detail to allow an independent assessment of the information provided, and also that robust study summaries are required for all the key studies. Finally, in relation to the last presentation, which we just heard from Karel, and in relation to the read-across hypothesis and justification, please remember that these must be detailed in the dossier, and that normally this justification is based on multiple lines of evidence. Another key message from this presentation was that the results from the read-across approach should be adequate for the purpose of classification and labeling and or for risk assessment purposes. They should have adequate and reliable coverage of the key parameters addressed in the corresponding test methods, and should cover an exposure duration which is comparable to or longer than the corresponding test methods. With that said, I would like to bring to your attention some of our next events for lead registrants. Starting from the second part of these information requirement webinars, The second webinar will be around the dealing of with data gaps and alternative methods. In other words, with the weight of evidence, the accusers, and the in vitro methods, which we have been mentioning already today quite a few times. So we really welcome you and suggest you to follow also this event, which will take place the 7th of March at the same time between 11 to 2 p.m. Helsinki time. We also have another webinar for lead registrants, which will deal with the chemical safety assessment and the Kaiser tool. And this is foreseen to occur in April this year. We then also have a couple of webinars which are open for all. The first one of which is on substance identity and data sharing as a CIF member. This will take place in March or April, and we would then encourage you to spread the word amongst your CIF member. Another one will be on downstream users' obligations and will take place in April. We also would like to remind you of the fact that we organize another lead registrant workshop in the second half of the year. However, if you want to be kept up to date about all these ECHA events, the best way is to do so is to subscribe to our e-news from our website, ECHA website, and therefore I recommend you all to subscribe. Coming to the questions and answer session, you can now stop submitting the questions. It is 12:45 Helsinki time. For the questions answered through the Q&A panel, the panelists will continue answering for another hour, that is until 1:45 p.m. Helsinki time. Therefore, if you have submitted your question but you have not received an answer, do not log off just yet. For the questions that will be answered by phone, I presume that the panelists have already contacted you again via the Q&A panel to propose a time slot, and this will begin at the end of the webinar, that is after 2 p.m. Finally, we remind you that for those of you who have been requested to submit the questions through the help desk form, as soon as you will do so, you will receive an acknowledgement of receipt, and we will then provide you with an answer within 15 working days. Last but not least, as your feedback is very important to us in order to always improve the services that we provide to you and to improve the content of these webinars for the future, once you will log off from this event, you will be automatically directed to a post-event survey page, which will take only a few minutes to complete, and we would really appreciate if you could do so. With that, I would like to thank you very much for your kind attention. Hopefully the information we provided to you this morning will be very useful to meet your information requirements and your registration duties. And I would like to wish you a nice day and goodbye from Helsinki.